Hello, good morning, and a warm welcome to our 5th Digital Transformation Summit. I'm Mark Stephen. I'm going to be chairing today's event. It's a fairly packed programme, and I don't think anybody would have dreamed just at Digital Transformation 2019 that just a year later, half of us will be working from home and we'll be living our lives on Zoom and Teams. Now, I'm not saying that Digit can take all the credit for that, but I like to think we've played our part. It is, as I say, an extremely packed programme today. If you're going to be tweeting, then please use the hashtag DT Summit. We have obviously transferred as much of the value as we can from the physical events into this virtual environment. We've got presentations, we've got discussions, we've got networking via live chat facilities. There's a heap of stuff in there. We have a great range of solution providers from across the supply chain in the exhibition area. Now, to be absolutely frank, these events are only possible due to their support and the support of sponsors. So please do take the time to visit the stand and engage if you possibly can. There are a number of competitions and prizes on offer in the exhibition hall with a leaderboard to reward interaction and participation. Don't say it doesn't work. Click on the leaderboard icon in the lobby to get involved. Exhibitors are also giving away prizes in their booths, including, and I'm going to run through the list here, a Nintendo Switch, £1,000 worth of Amazon vouchers, that's in total, not in one big lump, a Sonos speaker, Google Nest Mini, a security key, Apple AirPods, Apple HomePod. You can even win a £20,000 discovery workshop to explore how digital transformation can help your business. And I'm quoting here, and identify your pain points. I'm not sure I want my pain points identified, but I know what they mean. Most importantly, the ever-popular Star Wars Lego Millennium Falcon, before which everything else pales into absolute insignificance. We've introduced a new live video chat function to today's event, which will allow you to have real-time face-to-face conversations within the private chat system. There are also 3 group chat environments in the networking lounge that you can join to discuss key themes from the day. And finally, the conference sessions will run through a series of webinars. Now, to access the session, just navigate to the auditorium page and click the session that you would like to attend, or select the hyperlink in the pop-up boxes, which appears immediately before the main sessions. Now, this first session, we're going to be looking at what are the defining digital trends amidst what's euphemistically described as a challenging socio-economic condition. You know, not half. I mean, nobody's ever seen anything like this before. We're going to be taking a look at how organizations are transforming and how digital is helping those organizations to adapt, to navigate disruption and accelerate, hopefully, the recovery. I'm delighted to say that our first speaker today is Kate Forbes, MSP Cabinet Secretary for Finance for the Scottish Government. So without further ado, I'm going to hand across to her. Kate, thank you.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. And can I add my own welcome to everybody to the 5th Annual Digital Transformational Virtual Summit. And thanks so much to Digit for the kind invitation to speak at this very important event in Scotland's digital calendar. I can hardly believe that it's a year since I last spoke to you. And I think on that occasion, I spoke about the importance of digital transformation and our ambitions to be a leading digital nation. But certainly couldn't have predicted that in the intervening months and in the year ahead of us, we would see such immense challenges as the ones the current pandemic has brought, whether those were health in nature or economic in nature. And, you know, that begs the question as to sometimes we can't either predict the nature of the transformation, and we certainly can't stop it. Yet because of the pandemic and the challenges that has brought, we have seen the use and the importance of digital technologies increase at a rate that we could never have imagined. And so often in the last 2 years, I've stood on platforms talking about the benefits and the advantages to the Scottish economy, to Scottish businesses, and to wider Scottish society of digital adoption and of accelerating the rate of digital adoption. And what we've seen in the last year is that by necessity and by requirement, that pace of change and that rate of adoption has far exceeded anything that we've seen in the preceding years. Most of you, I know, will already be involved in a number of digital transformational projects which are supporting Scotland's journey towards becoming a digital nation. But what is different today, probably compared to last year, is that we've seen that digital transformation cut across all areas of society. Mark talked about the use of Teams and of Zoom, and whether it's helping families to stay in touch with each other or getting businesses online, right through to the way that we've used data at the vanguard of our public health response. The prevalence and the potential of digital technologies has been deeper and wider than what seemed possible previously. And I think there's a choice facing us right now. I believe we're at a crossroads. Now, whilst the pandemic is still with us, whilst we're still seeing a huge impact from the economic crisis, I think that we're at a crossroads in terms of the choices we make now to build on and continue that rate of acceleration of digital adoption, or to take our foot off the pedal. And my preference is very much for the former. And that's why we recently launched a consultation for a refresh of Scotland's digital strategy. I'm hugely excited about that refresh and the opportunity for us to use it as a catalyst to bring together the digital transformation ambitions right across Scotland. We want our ambitions to be big and bold and transformative, and we want to see a strategy that recognises that digital is front and centre of how we live and work. It's not an interesting additional aspect that we add on to the way that we live and work. It is right at the heart. It runs through the way that we live and work. And we've seen that in new ways over the last few months. And of course, as with all consultations, we want your views, because if there's anything else that's come through the last few months, it's the importance of partnership working. It's the importance of that cliche, I know, but that we truly are all in it together. And if we've been in it together to survive the pandemic and the economic crisis, then we are very much in it together when it comes to economic recovery. And I want to make sure that it's technology and it's digital that takes us through economic recovery. So I'd strongly encourage you to contribute to that consultation if you've not already done so. Despite the huge challenges that we face on many fronts, the success and the huge potential of the tech sector has been a source of optimism over the last few months, and as I look ahead to the next few years, not only in hard economic terms, but also for the way that the sector has really risen to the challenge and been a force for good over the last few months. We've seen the hugely amazing efforts of the Scottish Tech Army, where more than 1,000 volunteers have contributed to more than 100 projects, sharing their own expertise, their experience with businesses and organisations that needed it. And it's an incredible achievement, which has been to the great benefit of businesses and communities across Scotland. It has genuinely and obviously contributed to the resilience of communities and of businesses that might not have been able to get through the pandemic in the way that they have been able to get through. And so I'd like, in this early part of my remarks, to take the opportunity to personally thank each and every one of the Scottish Tech Army and each and every one of the volunteers for all the work that they've done, usually without much credit or recognition, in supporting digital transformation right across Scotland, in every geography, in every sector, and for so many different businesses and organisations. Now, I said earlier that we have seen the necessity of digital drive the rate of adoption in the last few months, and I think we're at a crossroads. And as I've said, I think Scotland's recovery will be, and certainly needs to be, tech-driven. It needs to be driven by people like you and your organisations. You know better than anybody else that the tech sector is optimistic by nature, and we've seen the recent survey by Scotland Is, where 68% of respondents ranked their prediction for the months ahead as optimistic, and 10% claimed to be very optimistic. And that's the level of optimism we need to power Scotland's recovery at a time where there is a sense of hopelessness and there's a sense of worry and despair about what the future holds. But it's that positive mindset and the potential to hope that will drive the growth we need to see to come out through this economic crisis into the years ahead, I'm thinking, whilst it's difficult not just to be reactive to the immediate challenges of the crisis, I want to think 10 years ahead. What are the choices that we're making now? What are the choices that we'll make in the immediate aftermath of this crisis that will lead to the results and the causes for celebration in 10 years' time? And you'll know that that's why I asked Mark Logan to review the tech sector ecosystem over the summer to help develop a blueprint to create a vibrant, world-class tech sector. And it's been great to see that blueprint and its recommendations have been positively received right across Scotland, not just amongst those that are self-professedly part of the tech sector, but right across Scotland. And we're working hard to implement those recommendations, announcing an initial £4 million of funding towards a national tech scaler network. And that funding will help establish 5 tech scalers and will support 300 to 500 high-quality startups over the next 5 years. And whilst the report was only announced or published in August, we moved quickly at the beginning of September to make that announcement of finance and also to accept the recommendations, to build that momentum, to drive that forward and to get behind what I believe will be the greatest driver of growth in the Scottish economy over the coming years. And the tech scalers themselves will be highly innovative spaces extending beyond the traditional incubation programs where entrepreneurs can meet, share ideas, access mentoring, world-class education and enable a country-wide participation to our high-tech economy. And I say that to you from, as I speak right now, from the Highlands, making sure that the opportunities for innovation, for entrepreneurship are there right across Scotland. Alongside the tech scalers, we'll also be setting up an ecosystem fund to make strategic investments in the organisations and the activities that create the best possible environment for our startups to succeed. Now, there are a whole host of recommendations, and I'm assuming that most of you will have seen the Logan review, and if you've not, I'd strongly recommend having a look at it. We've said that we accept most of the recommendations, and we're also carrying forward some of the others, like supporting programs to increase the number of startups emerging from universities. And I've had some early and very productive conversations with university representatives, and then also making more of Scotland's tech conferences like this one to attract the best talent and investment possible. So delivering on the range of recommendations will be challenging. It will require partnership working. It'll require new collaborations. We will need to work jointly with the tech sector, our education system, and investors. One of the core principles, I would say, running through the Logan review is that if it were easy, it would already have been done. But it's not. It's challenging. It's challenging to figure out how we increase the number of students coming out of university, college, and even school with computing science qualifications. It's challenging making sure we have enough computing science teachers. It's challenging making sure that we have a higher rate of success when it comes to supporting startups. Those things are challenging. And government certainly does not have a monopoly on trying to make that successful. I'm always so heartened when I see the success of Scotland's tech sector, the optimism that I've already talked about, the willingness to try new things, and more than anything else, the willingness to share expertise beyond the tech sector with the wider Scottish economy. And I think that this report and this review builds on the amazing success of the tech sector, but also provides a clear pathway for Scotland to be a global player. Despite the successes of our digital technology sector driven by organisations like yours, there's still so much that Scotland can do to make sure that each and every business in our economy realises they are a digital business. And I think, again, we've seen more businesses recognise that over the last few months because by necessity, they have had to adopt and accept digital ways of working. But we know that tech has made businesses more competitive and resilient in the last few months, and that principle needs to take us through the next few months and the next few years, because there are still too many who are not taking advantage of digital technologies, and that means that they lose out, their employees lose out, their customers lose out. And with a view to Scotland's finances, as Scotland's Cabinet Secretary for Finance, I'm also aware that our economy loses out as well. And so we're committed to supporting even more businesses to digitise. And during the last few months, we doubled funding for our Digital Boost programme to support SMEs to improve their digital capabilities. Because as a country, we are far greater than the sum of our economic endeavours. It's the choices we make about the type of economy that we want that will shape our future. And that is built on our core values, but also embraces innovation and entrepreneurship and a willingness to try new things. So whilst there has been much to celebrate in the last few years when it comes to technology, when there's much to reflect on over the last few months when it comes to digital adoption and new ways of working, I think we stand at a crossroads, and there are choices that we make now which will deliver results, not just next year, not just in 5 years, but in 10 years' time. That has to be underpinned with a clear vision, a clear blueprint, a clear plan for where we're going, and our digital strategy and the Logan Review, I think, provides a very helpful starting point for that. But ultimately, I want to see us build on the optimism and the innovation of the tech sector by taking forward those recommendations, by working closely with you, by recognising that you are the ones creating the jobs today and the jobs of tomorrow, solving the problems of today, whether that's related to COVID, and will continue to solve the problems of tomorrow. And there's a whole host of other businesses, other entrepreneurs out there that we want to ensure establishes themselves in Scotland to solve those problems and find those solutions. So thanks very much for the invitation this morning to share ambitions for Scotland to be a leading digital. They're big, they're bold, they're transformational ambitions, but they're not ones that government could ever deliver on their own. They're ones that we could jointly deliver, because I think they're in all of our interests to make sure that Scotland is that successful digital nation. And I hope that the choices that we do take today, in the next few months, are the ones that will lead to the successes in 10 years' time that are celebrated at conferences like this, conferences where we reflect on the last few years and realise that the efforts that we've taken, the investments that we've made, and the vision that we set out is what set us apart, not just within the UK, but internationally. So thanks very much.
Cabinet Secretary, thank you very much for that. There's an opportunity now to ask some questions of Kate Forbes. Just before I get to some of these questions, you obviously feel, and I quite understand this, there's lots of people who feel this, that there have been some distinct positives in the pandemic too. You know, in one bound, we made huge leaps forwards in our adoption of digital and how we actually work and how we live, etc. There are lots of demands, however, for financial support. So how do you prioritise that? How do you make those decisions?
It's such a great question, because it's an issue that has certainly dominated my mind over the last few months, because on one hand, there is an obvious need and demand for businesses just to survive. So to maintain the status quo and basically keep us ticking over. And on the other hand, you know, the economy, the world, Scotland is going to look hugely different after we're finished. And we have got to make sure that we're looking ahead, because the temptation for government is to be reactive. The temptation for me is to hear the noisiest, loudest voices and respond to that, rather than thinking long term. And it's that constant need that I certainly challenge myself with to look further ahead. So to answer your question specifically, there therefore has to be not just financial support for businesses looking ahead, but a longer term vision for what we're trying to achieve. Because I think in Scotland, country of 5 million people, it would be ludicrous to suggest we're going to try and compete in every industry, on every front, with every other country in the world. That's not sensible. But in terms of where we want to go, for a country of 5 million people, a small country, that's had some productivity challenges, but is small enough, nimble enough to hopefully get everybody around the table and find solutions. For me, the obvious answer here is that tech and digital has got to be at the forefront of that economic recovery. We need to be solving problems here, using our NHS, using other public sector organisations. We need to be solving problems here that can then be exported. So to do that, that requires this long-term vision. And that's why, again, going back to Mark Logan's review, rather than a scattergun approach of doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, where are we trying to get to? And what do we need to do to get there? That's why commissioning the Logan review in the midst of the pandemic, when actually it'd be far easier to have been reactive, was important. And where also there's been quite substantial sums of money, just under £50 million invested in some of the high growth recent startups that were really struggling to access funding during the pandemic, or their sources of funding that they were counting on had fallen away. So we've continued to support tech, but with limited resources, you're right, it's a challenge. But certainly I'm very, very keen that we're looking 10 years ahead.
That sets up rather beautifully a first question from the delegate. This is Adam Winstanley from FinHalo. And he says, I work in manufacturing and can see the answer, but as a startup, it's very difficult to move into the scale we need to make an impact. Innovation is not just for existing businesses, and yet investment and support is all geared to existing business of usual models. Can you support startup ideas better? New ideas, he adds, are the only ones that work in pandemic, and they've got the ability to create jobs. Big business can benefit from startup growth too, with partnerships. Thoughts on that?
Yes, so I think he's right. I think he's absolutely spot on. And I think there's two elements. There's a point there about funding, and then there's a point there about wider support. Because again, not to keep banging on about the Logan review, but one of the points that was quite consistently made there is better social infrastructure to support businesses, not just startups, but businesses that are already competing, looking ahead, have plans for growth and development and drive, but need support to do that. Where are they going to get the support? And there's the social infrastructure of putting, and I don't want to just use the word mentoring, but putting in place the support now, either through our enterprise agencies or through mentoring from businesses and business leaders that have done this kind of thing before. Or thirdly, access to some of the best training that the world has to offer, and providing that in Scotland. And one of the notions behind the sort of tech scalers is not just about, your startup with a brand new idea that may or may not work. It's where the businesses that have proven themselves, but have ambitions for bigger and greater things, have an eye on the international markets, but need support, some guidance, some expertise to bridge that gap. So I think that part's important. And then secondly, making sure our funding works. So one of the criticisms that's made is that often our metrics for providing public funding just don't work for tech or don't work for digital. They work for perhaps more traditional businesses. Take one example being the number of employees that you create. Now, for a business that's growing, probably the last thing you should be doing is employing more people until you've proven the value of the product or the service, because that absorbs funding. So, thinking about better metrics for the funding, the public funding that we provide, to ensure that it does enable growth and it doesn't actually stifle growth. Because if your public funding into these businesses is actually not delivering the end result, which is growth, then there's a problem there. So I don't know if that answers his question exactly, but I think it's a mix of the two in order to support not just your new startups, but your scale-ups as well.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question, and this is from Swain Hunter, Orkney Highlands Council, and he said, the current digit strategy consultation says geography, this is a quote, geography, background or ability should not be barriers to getting online and benefiting from digital technology. To achieve this, we need networks which reach every corner of the country, end quote. How can we make sure that this ambition is achieved? I mean, you're doing this in the Highlands, I live in rural Aberdeenshire. Broadband coverage is not great in either location. So, I mean, it's long overdue, this Cabinet Secretary. Yeah,
so I'm going to push back on the question and answer it as well. So in terms of the answer, I agree. I think I've got the constituency with the worst broadband connectivity in the UK, so I challenge anybody to care more about this than I do, considering that my constituents make this one of their number one priorities to complain about, legitimately so and understandably so. And we've obviously got plans with the reaching the 100%, which has been delayed by legal challenges, but is back on track to be delivered. And that's got to go hand in hand with mobile connectivity as well. It's not sufficient just to have the broadband, but we've got the infill programme with building masts in the most rural areas where no commercial operator would go of their own volition. So that would be the straightforward answer. I get it. The second part, though, is a pushback, which is I accept that there's parts of the country which don't have appropriate connectivity. But let's say, for argument's sake, that 3/4 of the country does. 3/4 of the country is currently not making the best use of digital technologies. 3/4 of the country, 3/4 of businesses are not making the best use of digital, are not as productive as they can be, are not using digital technologies to their best ability to be as resilient as possible. And I think that sometimes, I'm not suggesting the question has, sometimes we use the lack of connectivity as an excuse for why Scotland is not punching above its weight when it comes to tech and digital. And there's so many businesses and individuals, I'm sure, listening this morning who are doing exceptionally exciting things in Scotland, solving problems and all sorts of things. But there's so many businesses, and we see that from the stats, there's so many businesses that have not embraced technology. And it's an international competition. I've had conversations with my New Zealand counterpart and my Canadian counterpart in the recent months, and we're facing the same thing. How do we help SMEs to digitise? Because that is, if you have every SME digitising and using technologies better, you solve Scotland's productivity challenge overnight, because you're using the resources you have, and you're certainly more resilient as a business. And I think, again, at this crossroads where the economy is going to change, it'll be the businesses that have adopted and accepted tech, not just the fact that they put a website up 10 years and it's still online, but what are they doing? How are they working? And that, for me, is what will power the Scottish economy going forward. So an answer to the question, and also a pushback, that I don't think it's an excuse for why we can't do more.
Cabinet Secretary, as ever, a great pleasure. Your enthusiasm, it's a joy to watch, so it is. Kate, thank you very much for your time. Much obliged.
Thank you.
Right, moving on now. Our next speaker, and I should point out, at any stage you can put a question to any of our speakers. It'll come up on the bottom of the screen. There's a button down there, etc. You can put in your question, and I'll try and get through as many of them as I possibly can. Our next speaker is Mark Curtis, who's Head of Innovation at Accenture Interactive, and the theme of his talk is the age of relevance, 6 themes for the future. So, Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I just wish I was actually physically in Scotland rather than here in southern England. It would be good to be there again. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about people. And I'm going to talk about people because if we're going to innovate, and we just heard questions on that and Kate talking about it, we're going to innovate with digital technology in order to build a better future, then we have to think about people, not just the technology and our businesses. And I'm going to talk about that for 15 minutes. And what we've done is we've gone back over 10 years worth of trends that we create every year. We create a document called Fjord Trends, which comes out in late December. We're doing the same right now. But I decided recently to go back over that and try and understand what's happening and what we've seen happening over the last 10 years. And when you extrapolate forward from that and you add on the curveball that is COVID, where is this taking us and what does it mean for the human condition? And how do we interact with digital technology? And when we looked at all of that, we saw one very clear meta theme, and that meta theme is about relevance. So we think that one of the biggest things that's happening with people all over the world, and we do see this everywhere, is that there has been a decline in how people feel relevant. It's actually a crisis of relevance. And technology has accelerated, actually, this crisis in relevance. And you may say, well, what do you mean by relevance? What's causing this? And a whole number of things are causing it. a lot of things which are just bigger than us. So climate change, it's bigger than us. Can I actually do anything about it personally? Is it all just, the changing world of work, technology is coming to work, AI is going to take away my job. Actually, am I going to have a job? How do I become relevant as a human being if technology is going to take that away? Social media has come along. Social media creates what I call the asymmetry of glamour, where at any given moment, all of my friends appear to be doing something much more interesting on Instagram than I'm doing. Of course, the reality is, of all the people I track on Instagram, it may only be 2 or 3 at any given moment, and I go and do nice stuff occasionally as well. But still, I get that sense day by day by day over Instagram and Facebook and elsewhere that what I'm doing is irrelevant compared to what other people are doing. That's the asymmetry of glamour. And all of this is probably accelerated, not just by technology, but other major socio-economic trends, the loss of religion, loss of community in a lot of places, divergence of life outcomes between people who are university educated and not university educated, the massive divergence in politics, and of course fluid identities as well. So we pull up our anchors from the ocean floor so that we can be more fluid in who we are, and rightly too, but actually then is there a risk that we all become boats bobbing around on the ocean trying to figure out who we are? So we see relevance as being, if you like, a guiding theme, and I'd like you to think about that as I go through the things that I'm going to talk about, because COVID has absolutely accelerated this. COVID is an extreme example of a global thing that's happened that is so much bigger than us that it makes us question who we are. And we think that businesses that focus on helping people feel and become relevant, that's both employees and customers, will be the businesses that really gain economic advantage, business advantage over the next 10 years or so. And of course, right now, we're facing with what we call the triple uncertainty with COVID. We've got the disease uncertainty. We don't know where the exit is. We've got economic uncertainty. We don't know exactly how bad, how deep, how long the recession is going to be, nor indeed what the exit strategy is. And then we have the human uncertainty, which is the above two are so deep and important that you have to ask, how are we going to respond to this? And what we're seeing really clearly in all the research we're doing is that people's responses to this are changing month by month at the moment. And that means that as businesses, when we look at the human condition and we think, well, what's going on here? It's actually quite difficult to predict. But I am going to make an attempt to look at the trends of the last 10 years and say, well, what do we see? What are the main themes that we see which might frame how we think about customers, how we think about employees, how we drive our businesses forward over the next few years? So I'm going to rattle through these fairly quickly. The first one is that in the same way as with, if you think back to those early Nokia feature phones, if you think back to very early video games, they were really highly pixelated. And now we have extraordinary depth of field and content in video games, in what we can see in our smartphone, in the quality of the screen that I'm looking at right now. As that happens, what's happened is we've moved from pixelation to very high definition. The same thing is happening with people. So our data is basically becoming so rich and so varied and such a clue to who we are that we're moving from effectively very pixelated human beings, as far as businesses were concerned, to a place where our data is defining us with very high degrees of accuracy. And if you go back over the trends that we've written, you can see, even back in 2011, we were talking about the cloud, and there was a startup called PogoPlug that was offering you your own personal cloud where you would gather all your data. So already people were thinking about, how do we gather our data together? As we move forward over time, people began to worry about the amount of our data that was being collected, and that's a clear trend which we're still seeing play out right now. And you began to see development of startups like Ocean Protocol that gave you the opportunity, again, to gather all your data and manage all your data and control what companies saw in your data. Last year, or this year actually, we predicted the rise of what we call digital doubles. So digital doubles, think of digital twins, which are digital versions of large pieces of manufacturing equipment. Think of those, but actually put into a personal space where we have highly accurate, that's high definition, not pixelated, representations of ourselves where we manage our future. And that's where we think this is going to go. we think that the idea of predictive maintenance, that sounds like a very machine-based thing. Indeed, it is. It's where the terminology comes from. That idea of predictive maintenance is going to be applied to us. So think about the future and think about how you might want to run predictive maintenance on yourself in the future. What are the areas where you'd want to do that? Where health will clearly be a key driver, and that really doubled down this year for obvious reasons. Learning and your finances too are places where we want to use data in order to get this very high definition picture of ourselves through this double, literally this doppelganger, this mirror image of ourselves. But once we can see that, what does that do to our sense of self? If a lot of us is contained within this digital double, what happens to how we think about ourselves? That's still unknown, I think, but it'll be a really interesting one to watch. Secondly, these digital doubles are able to operate 24/7. So one of the things which has restrained, to some extent, the attention economy has been that we can only pay attention to things for about 16 hours of the day, presuming that you're a relatively normal person and you get 8 hours of sleep a night. But with digital doubles, effectively, a bit of us can be paying attention for 24 hours a day. So what does that mean? We're also going to see tension between who has access to people's digital doubles and who doesn't, and who actually owns the digital double. Will it be you that owns your digital double, or will it be a large organization like Google or maybe your bank? Who do you trust and how do you manage it? These questions are going to pop up a lot in the next 10 years, but we're absolutely certain that what we are going to see is the rise of, even if we're not using the terminology digital doubles, it will look like this accurate representation of ourselves that is able to do things. The next one I want to talk about, sorry I jumped over that too quickly, is digital versus physical. So again, a lot of the trajectory of the last 10 years has been the increasing combination of digital and physical together. And I mean, I know this has been much remarked on, but it is remarkable looking back at the last 10 years, the way in which we've seen that happen. And you could literally talk for hours on this subject. I think Uber and Airbnb rising to the fore around about 2015 was particularly interesting, because what was happening was that digital disruption, which had been taking place for some time, was largely about purely digital things. We began to see that invading the physical world. So really what was happening here was the physical world of bricks and mortar and vehicles were suddenly becoming assets which were being controlled by a digital control mechanism. And that was a really early and important sign we saw that digital and physical were merging. Then we've repeatedly come back to virtual reality and augmented reality. Again, heaps to say about where that's likely to go, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But we've seen that begin to emerge and lots of organizations beginning to innovate around virtual and augmented reality. And in the last 2 years, we've begun to see physical beginning to take digital and absorb it into the physical experience. So we see that, for example, with Amazon Go stores. We see it with Tao Cafe, an extraordinary development in China from Alibaba. We see it with things like Disney Magic Band, or Carnival Cruises have an equivalent of that on board their ships called the Medallion. So where does this mean we go? Well, again, COVID's either accelerated things or thrown a spanner in the works. And I think it's not so much a spanner in the works here, but I think what COVID is doing, and I'm sure most people would agree with this, is we're all absolutely desperate to get outside. When I say outside, I mean away from where we live and somewhere else, and come back to where we live. And physical experiences, concerts, stadiums, football games, you name it, just meeting other people in high density places will be at a premium, and we will definitely see those happening. But as Kate was just saying, we've undoubtedly adjusted to a more digital world. You can see that across the board in all the numbers around, for example, the amount of goods that we're buying. We've gone roughly from e-commerce being about 10% to 20% in the UK in the space of about 3 months. So we're adjusting to this more digital world where so much more of what we do, learning, shopping, birthday parties, yoga, everything has gone digital. And also what we're seeing is digital itself becomes a wrapper for lots of physical experiences. We will see lots happening with augmented reality hardware coming out over the next 2 to 3 years. That's what I mean by it's going to pop. But actually underlying that, what's really interesting is it's becoming part of the software. There was a really interesting announcement by NVIDIA the other day. They've now built some software which takes Zoom or Teams, for example, and will automatically adjust your eyesight as you're speaking. So it looks like you're looking exactly at the camera, which I could probably do with right now because I'm sort of flicking between the slides and the camera. So I might well turn it on. But that happens, that is a form of augmented reality. Effectively, think about it, it's augmenting me as I'm speaking. Now, we might think that's a great idea. Right now, it might be useful for me, but we might also think that's a perfectly horrid idea, because if I'm on a Teams meeting, I don't want to think that other people aren't really looking at me, but they're using a piece of augmented reality to pretend that they're looking at me while they're actually getting on with something else. And that, of course, is what I mean by it will bring unexpected ethical issues. So fundamentally, what we're going to see here is the augmentation of lots of ourselves and what we do through digital, often in a physical context. So they combine together, and that will bring questions about, well, what's real here and what's not? And at the same time, and this I'm also certain of, we're going to see, we're still in a phase now where we're responding to COVID by saying, oh, what can we do about shops? And how can we keep shops going? We actually probably need to go to a stage where we say, what's the point of a shop? What's the point of an office? What is the point of a stadium? And begin to build those back from the ground up. The third one is the ethics challenge. And what we've seen here has been really interesting. The trajectory, which is actually more recent, it wasn't really so much there 10 years ago, but the trajectory really kicked off about 3 years ago when we started to talk about what we called the ethics economy. And the main point here was that companies were beginning to have to become political and make political statements, and that their audiences, in particular actually their employees, were expecting them to do so. There was a marvelous quote from Tim Cook that year. He said, people should have values. Companies are nothing more than a collection of people. So by extension, all companies should have values. And it was interesting. I thought that was at that year symbolic of the shift that CEOs were beginning to make. Last year, we saw a huge focus on sustainability. And of course, that's not gone away. And I'm going to come back to that again later on. And all sorts of organizations beginning to realize that actually they could no longer function in the way they were before, and that the traditional CSR approach to this was not good enough, and they actually had to make substantive changes. So within the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, for example, you have PepsiCo, Unilever, H&M really beginning to make serious pledges about what they're going to do by 2025 to make sure that they go carbon neutral. And even now we have companies like BP saying they're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. Last year, as we see the growth of this, we see companies actually shift to a new space where they say, you know what, it's not actually anymore just about profit and shareholders, it's about something broader than that. And we called that many faces of growth. So you can see this trajectory towards what everyone is calling now purpose. Where we will go on this is going to be difficult. This is an awkward one, but we're going to see this tension between social purpose and business missions. And we've seen this spectacularly come to life with a startup in the US, many of you may follow, it called Coinbase, where their CEO, Brian Armstrong, recently said, look, I'm not interested in having debates at work about social purpose. We're focusing too much on other purposes, takes focus away from the company's main mission, which has purpose in it already. And I don't want to hear conversations about it at work, and we're not going to engage with this. And he lost 5% of his workforce overnight, but the rest stayed. So really interesting there, this tension between, are we in business to be in the business of business, or are we in business to do other stuff? My own view on this is that most companies are going to shift to, actually, it's a broader base than the Coinbase CEO defined it as. And they're going to get there, and we will see this accelerate over the next few years, because they will focus on purpose metrics, which will be both published and tracked, that is, publicly tracked. And that's where choices have to be made. So there's a tension at the heart of this, which is it's easy to talk about, but you can't do all the purpose things in the world you might want to. So we're going to see large organizations and small ones making difficult choices about, here's where we're going to focus our purpose on, and this is what we're going to measure. At the same time, we're going to see the rise of chief ethics officers. And I predict that in 10 years' time, almost all, if not all, major organizations will have them, and they will actually come to the boardroom with real power. Because if you think about what they do, it will cover a whole bundle of areas. The fourth one is about living services. And this is basically about the fact that we've entered a new era of digital. So, and we predicted this 5 years ago, and it was interesting, and I've gone back to it because I think we were too early. And of course, as all people who look into trends in the future, you can make huge mistakes. And therefore, you should take everything I say with a pinch of salt today. But with living services, we got it right. We just called it too early. And what we were talking about was the third era of digital. The first was desktop web. The second was smartphone. And the third was this one we call living services. And it did kick off 5 years ago, but it's only now really accelerating. And it's built on top of the digitalization of absolutely everything, the embedding of sensors everywhere in the world. And it's built on top of liquid expectations. So from a human perspective, this is about the fact that we now anticipate experiences to be as good as they can be, not by watching who is competing with who within banks, or is your grocery service as good as the grocery service next door, but we look at the best people who do experience, whether that's Apple or Google or Airbnb or whoever it may be, and we say, that's the experience I want from my bank or my telco or in my utility company. That's liquid expectations. Customer expectations now flow across and between industries rather than within industries themselves. And these two things together are powering this idea of living services, services that change in real time around the customer's needs, built on top of data, built on top of the cloud, and which literally flex around the customer. And the first time I really saw a living service and began to see, right, this is coming true now, and you've all probably observed this, is that Google's now common functionality that when you set the map to go somewhere, it often comes back to you and says the place you are going to will be closed at the time you get there. That's a living service. It's a service that's actually changing in real time. It doesn't have to be huge. It can be quite a small thing. In fact, often they're quite small things. What we're seeing now is many more businesses who are beginning to build the platforms, or have been building the platforms of digital transformation to make this happen. Cloud, cloud, applied intelligence, and over the next few years, 5G, those businesses are beginning to bring this to life. So with banks, for example, I'm sure Lou will have things to say about this, but with banks, I remember 3 years ago, one of the most insightful digital bankers I've ever met, a guy called Louise, used to work at BBVA, now works at Macquarie Bank in Australia. He said that he's the CDO there, and his brief to his team was, in the future, if a customer has to open an app to engage with the bank, we've failed. So a really inspiring vision and ambition level for what a bank should be. But now we're beginning to see it. So just before this conference this morning, I got a message from the bank saying, we've just paid out this in a direct debit. It's much higher than it usually is every month, because normally it's this average and now it's this. That's the living service. It's using context and data to deliver me in real time something that means at the surface level of my phone, I understand what's going on. I can go into the app and look if I want to, but it's giving me control and it's changing. And therefore interactions become more fluid, they become lighter, they become full of important information, and most importantly, what is invisible becomes visible. And I think that's a key thing to bear in mind if you want to build living services for your customers. And I think that is a business everyone should be in, is how can you make what is invisible visible, and how can you make the boring stuff, which is visible and people don't want to do, how can you make that invisible? So that's living services. The next one is about interactions. And fundamentally what we're seeing here is that shifts in technology are shifting the way in which we interact. Now, that's an easy thing to say, and we've all observed this happening. We've moved from basically interacting with technology through a screen and a keyboard and a mouse to one where we're engaging with all sorts of different technologies all the time. I can't even say her name, because if I do, it'll kick off the device quite near me at the moment. But the Amazon personality you speak to on your Echo is literally embedded. I don't know where it is. I don't need to know where it is. I know where the radio is because I have to go and switch it on. But I no longer need to know where the Echo Dot is because it can just be in the environment around me. We see the emergence of gesture touch screens or gesture screens, and increasingly it will be gesture, not touch, in public spaces. We see robots beginning to appear that we can talk to. We see things happening in public because of COVID, where our temperature is being taken automatically. That's happening in Beijing railway station at a rate of 200 customers per second right now. We're seeing all sorts of stuff appearing in the environment around us where digital, as I said earlier, is becoming embedded, but we're actually finding new ways to interact. Now, the important thing about this, and it's not commented on enough, is that every time we get a new development here, so we find new ways to, new kinds of etiquette need to appear in order to adjust to these. So if you think about etiquette, and it's important, if you think about the difference between email and messaging and Instagram and Twitter, all of them have complete, and Teams now, and Zoom now, actually. So new etiquettes have appeared over the last 9 months as we've become much more used to video communications. So we're adjusting as rapidly as we possibly can in our heads and our culture to the new etiquettes. How do conversations start? How do they end? Are they synchronous or asynchronous? These are key things about how humans behave, which are literally adjusting in real time to the plethora of technologies we're getting. That plethora of technologies is on the verge of becoming too much, and we've written about this quite a lot over the last 2 or 3 years. So as organizations, we need to begin to think pretty carefully about what is the volume and flow we can expect our users, and particularly our employees, to handle. We need to begin to look for technologies, and we will see them arise, where body language becomes much more integrated. I think one of the huge opportunities in the next 5 years is for technology for working at home will be transformed in the next 5 years. We still, at the moment, hack together a number of systems. So effectively, I've got one microphone, I've got a pretty poor camera, I've got a screen here. We've hacked all of this together out of laptops and other things. That will change, and we will see the emergence of better systems which allow us to communicate using body language, such an important part of human communication, much more richly at a distance. So lastly, we see how design has evolved. And at heart, I'm a designer. That's what I've been doing now for 30 years or so. And design has changed a lot, because back in the mid-teens, we began to worry about the consequences of the design choices we were making. And this really began to happen with social media, as we began, all designers and many other social observers as well, commentators, began to worry about what are the unintended consequences of some of the things which we build with technology, which look like they're a great idea when they launch. I won't name names of any social media, but then begin to cause all sorts of disruptive problems. And Pokemon Go, seamlessly a really harmless idea, was a really good example of that, where we actually saw people in one instance murdered so that they could get to an item on Pokemon Go quicker than anyone else. I mean, that's very extreme, but it's in the, unintended consequences. A much less extreme one is what everyone now knows, which Airbnb's huge and rightful success distorted property markets in many major cities all over the world. And as we track through the years, what we see increasingly is design beginning to ask questions about itself. And I particularly want to focus on, we've talked for years now about user-centered design, because that's where we had to go with technology. But actually what we've shifted to now, or we are shifting to, is what I call life-centered design, which is we need to think about systemic effects of everything that we do. And to really sort of wrap this up, where we're going with design is a place where sustainability and what I would call systemic social issues are things that we now need to put right in the middle of our design systems. We can no longer just focus on the user themselves and their selfish needs. I don't mean selfish in a pejorative sense. We have to focus on the system around that. And that is where we're going to go. And when I talk about design, I don't just mean what designers do. We are all in the business of design as we are innovating and creating new things. And within 10 years, we will not be designing these things without those sustainability and systemic vantage points being brought to bear on what we do, because millennials and younger than millennials won't let us. So ethics is coming mainstream into design, and that will be unanswerably part of what we do, as like I say, probably within 5, but definitely within 10 years. So I better stop now, because I think I've got a little over time, but if we look back over the 6 themes, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning about relevance. If you look into each of these, all of them are about how do we see ourselves in the modern world, and how does technology define ourselves. And there are massive opportunities for businesses to think deeply about this and create services and products using a mixture of physical and digital, which help us find relevance and a path to who we are in the modern world. So with that, I should definitely stop. Thank you very much for your time and attention this morning.
Mark Curtis, the Head of Innovation at Accenture Interactive. Mark, thanks very much for that. We seem to be having, I think, slight difficulty getting hold of Louise. Louise Smith, Chief Digital Officer at Lloyds, and she will be coming up next. She's relogging just at the moment. But if I can stick with you, Mark, you were talking about the fact that, in your opinion, you will start to see things like chief ethics officers.
Yep.
Right now, I wonder if that's because we have the luxury of time and space to actually do it. If there is, as a lot of people predict, a huge and rather deep global recession, we know from human history that, when there's a panic, the rush for lifeboats or the rush for the emergency exits, people don't always behave at their best. The same also holds true for businesses.
I think that's true, and I, you're absolutely right to bring that up. The recession, and it is hard to escape the conclusion that it is already pretty severe and is going to get worse, is a massively complicating factor. And you're right, it will mean that people draw in on themselves and companies draw in on themselves. But I think that what we have with the issues raised by technology and broader, issues like Black Lives Matter, for example, is that we've gone past a turning point. And I don't think, up to a point, however severe the recession gets, I think we've gone past a point where we start going backwards and saying, and we've had recessions in the past, but we've also held on to the new social values that we've developed. And I think that this recession will be one where we go, yes, we've got to manage the recession, but issues like sustainability, we have to address these as well, because I do think we've gone past some sort of tipping point on that. That is hard to validate, and it is a guess about the future. I'll be clear on that. And, we may need to get back together again in 5 years' time and argue whether it was true or not. But I think these things have gone past some point.
Okay. Returning to your point about digital doubles, it's something I've never heard of before. I find it absolutely fascinating, this idea of having a virtual doppelganger that, that never sleeps and it can be optimized unlike me. But listening to that, my concern was, what if a gap develops between what it's achieving and what I'm achieving? Does that make me feel bad?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're beginning to see some of these emerge, by the way. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, and there was not enough time to sort of get into all of them, but we're beginning to see some of them emerge. For example, there's an app called Eterni.me, which allows you to digitize yourself so that your descendants can see you in perpetuity, which might sound really, really weird. In fact, it is really, really weird. But then, my dad died about 10 years ago, and pretty much not a day goes past when I think, God, it would be really nice to see him. I'd use it. Yeah. So those things are beginning to appear. I think the question you've asked is fundamentally a design question, which is how do we design those things so that they are helpful to us rather than creating some image of ourselves, which we can never achieve, a slimmer, fitter, prettier image. And I think that is a design question, and it would be a mistake to go there. I think also the other thing is a lot of what you see in predictive maintenance with machines. By the way, for example, all aircraft engines have predictive maintenance. Yeah. A lot of what you see there is where you're looking at the aggregate of how all of the machines are performing. So if I can look at the aggregate of how all people like me manage their money, that might give me hints and tips about better ways to manage my money. If that can be presented to me in a way which doesn't make me feel like an idiot, then that's I think the way to present it, rather than here's something which is like you but is going off in its own direction and is just better than you all around.
Okay. I've been following, as you've been speaking, I've been following at the same time the chat with Louise Smith, Chief Digital Officer in Lloyds. I'm delighted to say we've got her back up. She's connected through another Wi-Fi, apparently. Louise is going to be talking about the fact, the old analogy of the oil tanker, huge, monolithic, very difficult to either stop or change direction. That also obviously applies to organisations. The bigger you are, the harder it is to actually change. But can you learn? So looking at organisational transformation and entrepreneurial thinking, here's Louise Smith, Chief Digital Officer at Lloyds. Louise. We haven't got it. Yeah. Sadly, folks, we're giving that a go there. We did try changing Wi-Fi, but that didn't work. If we put Mark Curtis back up, I think that would be quite useful at this particular point in time. Mark, can I see you again? There we go.
I'm here, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, fair enough. I can't actually see you, but I'm sure it's actually happening in real time. We'll see something there. There are so many issues here. There's such a, you said in terms of digital bubbles, looking at health, learning, finances, etc. Who do you actually trust to hold that doppelganger? I can't think of anybody that I would trust. I'm not even sure I would trust my wife to hold that doppelganger. So why would I trust either Google or a bank to hold that doppelganger?
Actually, I think so. There's two answers to that. The one is there is an opportunity space for somebody to emerge to offer a neutral service where you are given the keys to it and you can be certain, you can be absolutely certain that nobody is controlling this apart from you. I think the challenge to that is that if we are becoming high definition humans, and we definitely are in data terms, I don't have the time or the energy to manage all my data, and I don't think most people do, nor do they have the inclination. So ultimately, there's a trade-off here where you're going to be paying somebody to take that on for you and to look after it for you. So then you do get to the trust question. And my hypothesis is actually there is a golden opportunity for banks here. Banks are a place where we trust our money. And actually, if you look at the numbers, trust in banks is remarkably high. People generally do trust banks, and banks look after our money, and we earn interest on it. So why should they not look after our data, and we can earn interest on that as well? I think it is a big leap for banks to make. I'm quite surprised we haven't seen any of them making it yet, but they look to me the closest thing I can see to a neutral organization which doesn't create or own, well, they do create and own some of the data, but a neutral organization who have brand permission to do this. And the brand permission is an important one. Would you trust, a supermarket chain, without naming any, to run your digital double? Well, probably not, because I don't think they've got the brand permission to do that. But I do think banks are probably closest. And maybe Google are as well. Maybe people would trust Google. But that, I think, also raises all sorts of difficult issues, which I'm probably not the right person to comment on, about, antitrust legislation, monopolies, the degree of power Google has, and the amount of pushback that we're beginning to see at state level against the power that the big tech companies have. So, because of that pushback, I think it's less likely they will own this and more likely that we will see different kinds of companies step forward into that space.
Given the fact that everyone's data's got a value, yes, in the first instance, I might trust the bank to hold on to my information, and to curate it, that will be fine. What's stopping them at some stage down the line taking a business decision to either share it or sell it to somebody else? How could you prevent that?
Well, the obvious answer is, a lot of that depends on the terms and conditions. A huge amount of trust is going to be required here. So they're going to have to be extremely clear on the terms and conditions under which they're doing business. And if they haven't actually, if they haven't got the transparency that gives them the permission space to do that, if they don't communicate with you at that moment and say, we're going to do this, are you comfortable with it? Then I don't think businesses that fail to act with that kind of transparency are not going to get that trust from us, which will allow them to be the one ring that holds all the data together. So
you gave so much of yourself away there.
But I just don't think, transparency is so important. And maybe there are other business models here as well, where effectively we pay an organization in order to hold that data and keep it secure, but we do so in the knowledge that they're never going to share it with anyone else. Or we give them grades of permission to share the data with other people. One thing that is important here is that the amount of money you can make off data sharing, several startups are trying this. The amount of money that you and I can make by sharing our data is incredibly marginal. So it sounds valuable, but there's another asymmetry here. Your understanding of how valuable your data is much higher than its actual real world value because it's personal to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously. I'm just watching what the sort of chat is going on in the background at the same time. Yeah. Let's give this one more go and see if we can get hold of it. We can't get one more go, Louise Smith, because apparently it's crashed again. This is quite extraordinary. Oh, there we go. There's Louise Smith. Louise, could you very briefly, and I'm sorry, originally you were scheduled to do 15 minutes, and I very much apologise for this, but just because we have designated slots on this, can you try and keep this a bit on the short side, please?
Sure, of course, and it's probably a great example of why some of the work that we're doing at the moment we need to accelerate, isn't it, actually? So just very briefly, and I just want to connect a couple of things that Kate and Mark have actually talked about, which is around, I think, one of the things that we have to be really focused on as we move forward is that innovation is no longer about technology, but actually I think it is more about behaviour, culture, purpose and people. And I think if anything has taught us that over the last few months, COVID has, and I think we're going to have to learn to adapt and drive forward. I work in an industry which I think is probably, and I know Mark talked about this in a previous speech around, is probably one of the ones that is going to have to accelerate. Insurance hasn't. I work at Lloyds of London. It's a 300-year-old organisation. It's a marketplace at the heart of the London insurance market that deals with cybercrime, climate and pandemics. And it's pretty critical to what we're going through now. We launched our strategy about a year ago. It's called Blueprint One. And the programme that's delivering that is called The Future at Lloyds. And we've been very public about how we're driving that digital transformation to deliver the world's most advanced insurance marketplace. We're about to launch Blueprint 2 in about 2 weeks' time. And what you'll see in there is how we've worked with the market in open research, in open learning, in open test, proving things are bad ideas, not good ideas before we start, in consultation with the participants of the market. And what you will see within that is very much an acceleration of that digital journey. The one thing I'll say, and as you've said, Mark, I will be brief, is we are moving much more to research in the open, design in the open, learn in the open. And we've done that through our website. You can sign up, you can be part of our journey. We had about 300 individual market participants sign up within the first 24 hours to actually be part of redesigning the experiences that drive through this market, because we see it as so critical to how we actually move forward. And so many of the things that Mark has talked about, you'll see applied to our digital transformation. And please have a look at it when we launch it in the next couple of weeks. I'd love your feedback. I can't leave my presentation without mentioning as well the Scottish businesses who are working with us. So one of our design partners is Niall, who's very much at the heart of Scotland. And also we've been working with Peter Proud and the team in Forret to drive our web strategy. And I think that's important. What you'll also see as part of our launch is we're very much wanting to work with the startup community, the insurtechs, the fintechs, the regtechs, all of those, to actually accelerate what it is that we do. And it's a real privilege to do this role. And it's a real privilege to do this role at this point in time. working with some of the most amazing insurance talent we have in the market here, but also looking at how do we bring in digital data researchers, designers, engineers to actually also work with us as we drive that forward. I know that we've had some technical problems, so I've promised to keep it brief, but please do have a look at some of the work that we're doing, because I think it will bring to life some of the points that Kate raised, but also some of the points that Mark has said that we see coming. I think some of those are here now. I don't think they're in the future. I think they're here now, and particularly around some of those ethics, sustainability and purpose, because I think people will look much more for that, which is one of the things that we've seen come through this. Hopefully that was brief enough, but gave you a bit of a flavour for what it is that we're doing.
Class, thank you very much. Can I put something back to you that I really wanted to put to Kate Forbes, because she was saying, with new entrants and people who are trying to be innovative and what have you, they can communicate with basically local enterprise companies and things like that. And I'm thinking, actually, is that not back to front? Because what they're doing is they're talking to people who did it the old way. If you've got somebody who's actually genuinely innovative, will an existing business necessarily understand that?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And Mark, I've been here since February, and I don't know whether you've ever been here, but we're in one of the most iconic buildings in the world, actually. And also it's centred around 3 floors that are underwriting floors, which are quite incredible. Some of that is good history, some of our history isn't, though. And we're looking at how do we bring the physical world, the digital and data world together. But the one area that people asked us to help them with when we went into remote land wasn't placing risk. We could do that, actually. The third-party placing platforms that we work with, the PPLs, the white spaces, they did that really well. But it was about how do they communicate, connect, collaborate, meet in a virtual land. So I think in terms of, I think we're seeing a bridge closer, and it's too early to say, between some of those early stage, those startups and some of those more mature businesses, how they connect and collaborate in a much more integrated way. As I say, it's still too early, but I'm seeing some pivots or moves within that space. So I think it's one that we need to continue to push.
How do you find it personally? There's a comment here about, even using technology away, the danger of losing our humanity here, the fact that we can't mingle, rub elbows, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's the one thing that we've all missed, isn't it, actually? That human. It's quite interesting because everybody talks about the future of work. I think all of that will sort itself out. I think what we have to be really careful about is how do we continue to use those physical places for social interaction, for collaboration. So the worst thing would be is we just all turn up and do exactly what we did before. Actually, we need to use these spaces to interact and collaborate better. But one of the things that I think we have to watch, and what worries me, is I think that diversity as actually, and inclusiveness as actually one there where that gap has actually started to grow in COVID. I see us not connecting as tighter on that diversity agenda or that inclusion agenda as much as we need to. And what I mean by that is not percentages, not targets, but how do you truly engage people in a completely different way? And particularly as some of us return to the office, I'm in the office, you can see, some of us aren't, but actually how do you make it feel still connected in? How do you drive that diversity, and how do you make sure that we don't create broader gaps? That's one area that I think we need to be careful as we move forward, Mark.
Can I put exactly the same question to Mark? Because this actually came through from Simon Elliott from HSBC saying, why do we need, he quoted you, why do we need drops offices, stadiums and using technology? Again, it's exactly the same point. It's this business of, yes, we can come up with technical solutions, but are we at risk of actually losing something? Are you hearing that, Mark?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, sorry. I wasn't sure whether you were asking Louise or me. I think I want to clarify that point given the question, which is, when I talk about why do we need shops, what I mean is, what is the benefit of a shop? what happens there, which is better than or different from what can be done digitally, and how do we then build on top of that? And when I'm talking about building it from the ground up, and same thing with offices, same thing with the stadium. And Louise just mentioned about going back into an office. I mean, I'm gagging to get back into an office. I never thought I'd say that. And then you have to analyze, well, why? And largely, a lot of it is to do with meeting other people and talking face to face, and that richness of human communication and interaction, which is so lacking over digital. But actually, there are other things to do as well. It turns out that I gather a lot of information without knowing I'm doing it while I'm going to work. That information gathering has gone. All I see is the fields outside and a few sheep and the walls around me and my family and the dog. That's it. So I'm losing all this information gathering. And eventually, you get tired of information gathering by looking at a screen X by Y big. So, analyzing what these things called shops, offices, stadiums, what do they bring us? And then thinking, how can we focus on those and build out the benefits and advantage of those? Because if we don't do that, a lot of the digital stuff will be the place where we go. So if we want to look at the future of those institutions, we need to rethink them from the ground up and not to go away.
I agree.
Absolutely ghastly advert at the moment, Louise, on telly. It's about broadband. Only a decent broadband coverage you'll be able to get through, and it's an embarrassment and terrible. Now the trainee is after your job. I mean, that's actually quoted within that. But the fact is, when people can't come into the office, sometimes for some people, neurosis kicks in. You can't see, as Mark says, you can't see those thousands of clues that you would see normally.
Yeah, but we're doing what we always do, aren't we? I mean, nobody would have envisaged a world where we all catapulted to remote in March, and we certainly wouldn't have here. I mean, it was unthinkable to close the Lloyds of London market, the underwriting route. It was really sad as well, actually, in terms of what that created. But we're now doing the opposite of, well, what happens when we come out of remote? Do we all go back in? It's like we swing from left to right, and I don't think that's the answer. This is a leadership challenge. What we have to do is make sure that those people who, for whatever reason, don't come in, or because it isn't about travel, it's actually about we're building skills somewhere else. We feel like we need to connect, and I hope we do connect with talent that we haven't connected with before. You don't have to be in the office to be seen productive or integrated or connected in. I think Mark is bang on. We have to, this isn't about going back. This isn't about hybrid work, in which I hear again, it's what is the new? How do we engage, connect and collaborate in a completely different way?
One last very, very quick answer from both of you. This is from Shan Jones from Computershare, saying, most companies will have extensive continuity plans. Have you seen an example of a business that was truly prepared for such a quick overnight shift to remote working? Or, I suspect this is the correct answer, are we all just winging it? Louise, first start. Louise?
I think she might have problems with her Wi-Fi.
I think she might. Well done again. That's unfortunate. That's right. Mark, quickly an answer on that then, please. Are we just
winging it? We're all just winging it, is the answer, I think. I've not seen a business which had any plans which could deal with what's happened. And I think that, one of the things that we'll see is we need to redefine things. So one of the things that we see, for example, is people talking about remote contact centers. Those call centers where customer service was frequently done by people on phones or over the web or whatever it may be. We can't talk about remote contact centers because they're not a center anymore. They might be remote and they might be about contact, but the center thing is gone. And that's actually not just wordplay, it's quite important because it means that you haven't got those people gathered together. So then you need to think continuity. What are you losing when you don't have those people together? And how do you replace that knowledge base, because that's probably what you've lost, is that collective knowledge base in one building. How do you replace that when people are working remotely? And those are the questions we need to be asking for continuity.
Mark, thank you very much. I mean, you've done a stunning job, not just in delivering your presentation, but also in answering questions and coming backwards and forwards and having to respond to Louise's Wi-Fi problems. She's extremely apologetic. I'm delighted we got her, albeit very briefly. But Louise Smith and Mark Curtis, thank you both very much for your time. Much obliged to you. Thank you. We're going to take a 15-minute break now, folks. This is a very good time to visit the exhibition hall if you've got the time. There are some great prizes available that I enumerated earlier. Please take the time to engage with the sponsors if you can and to speak with other delegates. But from me, Mark Stephen, thank you very much for the moment and see you in 15 minutes. Thank you.